Good evening, dear guests and colleagues. This is ECFR's webinar on Georgia. My name is Pavel Slunkin, and I will be moderating our today's discussion, the title of which sounds like Georgia's fight for its future, understanding recent protests in Tbilisi and the rift between the government and the wider population. I'm happy to introduce you our today's very special guests, Regis Jonte, a Caucasus and Central Asia correspondent for the Le Figaro, Radio France International, and France 24. He is now in Tbilisi. Good evening, Regis. Katarina Maternova, Katarina Maternova, Deputy Director General, DG Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations for the European Commission. Thanks for joining us, Katarina. Good evening.
Hello, good evening. Sorry, I don't know which camera is the one. I guess this way you will see me.
Right.
Okay.
And Jaba Devdariani, soliciting editor for Civil Georgia. Good evening, Jaba.
Good evening.
I also remind you that you can ask your questions and ask them for the Q&A chat box section, and then after we'll be having the first intervention by our speakers, then I will read them. If not, then I will ask my questions, and I have a long list of them, but I still welcome you to do this, you personally. So let's start. Several weeks ago, Georgians took to the streets of their cities to protest against a draft law on foreign agents. Despite the tough reaction by the police, the protesters stood until the government surrendered and withdrew the controversial draft law. However, this was far from the first time when Tbilisi city center was full of people. In the recent years, this happened regularly. People had to protest against arrests of their political leaders like Nika Melia, former President Mikhail Saakashvili, against the election results, and against the pro-Russian course of the ruling party. Regis, would you please give us a broader context of those political developments in Georgia in the last years? Why is it all happening? How popular is the current government among Georgians, and how, let's say, democratic reforms going on, or have they stalled completely, or even, I don't know, turned into anti-democratic reforms? And most importantly, where does it lead Georgia to? So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That's a great pleasure to attend, to talk to this event tonight. And I feel it's quite important. I should remind, as I do all the time at the moment, that finally the war in Ukraine started somehow in Georgia back in 2008. This is the same war, the same move, the same dynamics. So it's very important to pay attention to what's going on in Georgia, despite the fact that the country is quite small, but it is really important and telling a lot. I will start with the recent event. I will try to give what I understood in this event and why it happened, and then from time to time I will give some elements of background, let's say, and try to address some of your questions. I would say that what happened was really expected. We didn't expect that it would go through this specific law, but the fact that there would be such crisis for these reasons, for this disagreement, let's say, between part of the Georgian population, maybe the elite or maybe small groups, and the government, was really expected. And I will come back to that. It will help to give this background. I published with the ECFR back in December, but it was written in October, a report on Georgia, precisely because we were expecting something like this, and we were right to do it. And in this report, I wrote, for example, sorry to quote myself, to quote the report, but we said that, for example, the divergent goals of the Georgian people and of the Georgian government could become a source of recurring crisis. So we wrote this before, and this is exactly the kind of crisis that happened 3 weeks ago that we were speaking about. And on the reasons for that, we recalled in this report that over the past 18 months, Georgia's ruling coalition has made a series of moves that seem designed to distance the country from the West and shift it gradually into Russian sphere of influence. This is exactly what we saw, what we observed 3 weeks ago. I didn't expect that it would be such a law, but we expected something like this, that a move from the government that forced, let's say, the country to cut its ties with the West, and that spoiled radically the relations with the West. For me and for several observers here in Tbilisi, it was absolutely obvious, especially after what happened on the 5th of July 2021. That was the day for a kind of march of pride from the LGBT plus community in Tbilisi. And some organizations, so-called from the civil society, from the far right side, from the Orthodox and nationalist movement, promised to be really violent. The LGBT community decided to cancel it, but still there was this anti-Pride March rally that took place on Rustaveli, the main avenue of Tbilisi, and the day turned very violent, especially not against the LGBT, they were not in the street, but against the West and against Europe. Twice the European flag in front of the parliament was put down. A cross, a Georgian Orthodox Church cross was fixed in front of the parliament. It is still there. It is still there. And when despite the violence and the thousands of videos we had, we knew who did what and so on. No one has been punished for that, even not with very small, court decisions and so on. Absolutely nothing. And we understood, and I'm not going into the details, but that these people were protected by the government. I studied which were the groups on the street that day. I identified like 4 or 5 different groups around some personalities or some organization. All of them were obviously connected with Russia. Some were paid with Russia. We had evidence on that. I mean, real hard evidence on that, like the Alliance of Patriots, which is a so-called opposition party. And we know that thanks to some hacking of the accounts of the Kremlin, directly the administration of the president, that they got $1.2 million back in 2019, for example, to campaign. So, and that day was seen by me, for example, but the beginning of the exit strategy or the exit policy of the Georgian government of the European or the Western road, which is a very, which was really historical, let's say, because we know that this country, I could say since 2 centuries, but at least since 30 years, wants to join the European family. So that event was really important, and for a lot of us, it was a benchmark of the beginning of this exit policy, let's say. These various groups that were in the street that day, we knew them already because they were before in the street, and they were often mobilized by the government against the opposition since 10 years. Not constantly, and it was, let's say, increasingly, but we saw them against sometimes some opposition group, sometimes in local elections where they decided to intervene and to threaten the people, frighten them. Or, for example, back in 2018, when there was some rallies after very famous nightclub Bastiani, which played an important role in the Georgian politics. I'm not going to details, were raided by the police, and at the time, these people who came in the street to challenge the people from the Bastiani nightclub. So that's why it is really important, and this is why since July 2021 we expected that something would happen, something more radical to really exit the European path. And this is why I was among the people, and I think I was really not alone these last weeks to make the comparison, and maybe, I don't know if Jabba will speak about that, but to compare what happened in Georgia these last days and finally these last years, but with what happened in Ukraine at the end of Yanukovych. And there is a kind of Yanukovych switch, which we could observe in Georgia. I guess we'll speak about that later. Of course, it's a bit risky to explain the things as I do, because of course behind we understand that probably Russia is acting, or at least there is an understanding between the Georgian government and especially Mr. Ivanishvili, who is this billionaire, this oligarch who is leading really firmly who got the control on the Georgian government. It works because they often, and it is difficult to understand what's going on in Georgia, because the government shows itself or presents itself as a pro-European one, and they did a lot indeed, even to join. I mean, to work to the rapprochement with Europe. But they do that also because they know that precisely if the U-turn towards Russia would be too quick, we could get a kind of Georgian Maidan, let's say, and everyone in the region, of course, has got this in mind. And because the Georgian population, and I think since 20 years, I observed the same. I'm reading the same surveys showing that something like 75–80% of the Georgian people see themselves as pro-European. So you can't make an open pro-Russian U-turn, and it explains a lot on this very difficult, let's say, to decipher, to understand politics in Georgia these last years. But again, these last 2 years, we saw this sliding, accelerating towards against the West. Mostly, it was less presented as a pro-Russian policy than an anti-Western policy, which fits also with the negative, let's say, soft power that Russia is using in Georgia. Not saying that Russia is good, come to us, but saying the West is bad. For example, joining the West means that the LGBT will become much more important in the society and so on. So this is what we can see. But for example, I mean, many examples show how this policy was implemented these last 2 years. And for example, I will quote a little calculation that was made by a very good Georgian media, OC Media. They published an article on the 1st of August 2022, last summer, and they just counted, for example, from the beginning of the war in Ukraine, or the large, wide-scale invasion of Ukraine back in February last year, till end of July last year. They counted, they just look at the statements made by the head of the ruling party, Mr. Irakli Kobaridze, and they counted that 9 times only he was saying something against Russia or critical towards Russia and its officials. 9 times. 57 times was against the West and European and Americans. 26 times statements against Ukraine and Zelensky, and 15 times it was statements against sanctioning Russia and so on. So you see, it's quite obvious what was the mood of the country. One of the key moments of the exit strategy that I'm trying to describe was on the 16th of May, 16th, 17th of May last year. 16th of May, the director of the main opposition TV was trialed and immediately arrested for some really reasons which are not serious, let's say, because he used a corporate car for his private use, and for that he got 3.5 years of prison. And it is important to mention that it was on the 16th of May, because the 17th of May, the Prime Minister had to go to Brussels to talk about the candidate status for Europe. So it was the best way indeed to make sure that Brussels would not grant Georgia with this status. And I think this timing is extremely important. As you know, so this is a kind of, I mean, the end of a long process, which was quite slow in the first years, when we saw this government first playing a kind of democratic game. And indeed, some more televisions from opposition appeared in the Georgian media environment, for example, but slowly by slowly, and then accelerating, we saw finally the government sliding towards a non-democratic policy, which became extremely obvious with this law so-called against foreign agents, which contradict, I mean, term to term the European values, and it was probably made for that. We understood, all of us, that the sanction, the targets of this law were the NGOs, the media, and it is contradicting exactly the 10th point of Europe that Europe set back in last June to ask Georgia to fulfill these points before to decide to grant or not. So the 10th point, which is about the NGOs, for example, was totally contradicted by this law precisely. And the same with the 7th point on the 12 points set by Brussels. This one is on the media, and we see that the law was exactly going against the freedom of media, of course, while Goramia, the head of Mtavari television, is still in jail, of course. And I could take a lot of examples. Probably I already talked since 10 minutes. I should stop. I just want to say a few words to finish in 1 minute. If it continues this way, and when we see the dynamics, we understand that there is probably no chance, and this is the feeling that everybody has, or a lot of people have in Tbilisi, that the Georgian Dream government will satisfy the EU on these 12 points and to get a chance to get the candidate status to the EU. Of course, it raises a question for the EU that if we should or not give the candidate status to Georgia, if it should be given to the people of Georgia, which demonstrated with this rally 3 weeks ago that they want to be European, and the government, which obviously doesn't want at the moment for reasons that we will probably explain a bit later. I will stop here, and then we'll take the questions.
Thank you very much, Regis. And I really recommend you all read the policy brief that Regis wrote for the CFR recently. It is published on the CFR website, and Regis shared some of his conclusions from this paper. Now we will come to Java. Regis already paid a bit of attention on this Russia's influence, and there have been many rumors about Russia's involvement and its influence over the ruling party, over Ivanishvili. How would you assess this influence? Moscow has been restraining from criticizing the Georgian government for a pretty long time already, while, as Regis also mentioned, the ruling party is also not very critical to Moscow. The unofficial political leader of Georgia, Ivanishvili, had business ties and maybe has political ties with Russia. And what he's doing seems to be accommodating at least some of the Moscow's interests. So what would be your take on this?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. This is, of course, a million-dollar question, and the one that has an obvious answer, but it's very difficult to argue. So I'll try. If Regis mentioned already the Yanukovych moment, and I think since most of us right now know all of Ukraine's little villages by heart, it is easier to superpose the Georgian situation on the Ukrainian one to a certain extent. What we have right now in Georgia is very similar to what was happening in Ukraine post-2014. We have occupied territories. We have the levers of influence that Russia had anyway, but the levers that have been strengthened since. This is the influence of the church, which is very directly connected to the Russian Orthodox Church, and refrains from either condemning Ukraine war or Russia's role in it. We have the economic relationship, which has been growing stronger rather than weaker under this government. Partially, this was a part of the announced policy to improve relationships with Russia on the non-political sphere. But on the other hand, it is kind of surprising that Georgia, that has an association agreement and a free trade agreement with the European Union, instead has strengthened the economic ties with Russia. Only last week, there was a session held at the Russian Ministry of Economy when several important areas were considered in which their sides agreed to enhance economic dialogue, such as, for example, to facilitate the entrance of the Georgian wine to the Russian markets and facilitate other trading ties. And of course, there is a matter of oligarchy, something that the European Union mentioned as number first in its demands to Georgia, de-oligarchization. But it is very easy to say and very difficult to achieve for a very simple reason. In difference to Ukraine of 2014, Georgia has one oligarch, not many. So it is not a competitive process in which certain things come to light due to the very nature of competition. Instead, in Georgia right now, we have the government, which is profoundly non-political. I would be troubled to name even one government minister right now who had the political career before, has run for elections or won them in absence of Mr. Ivanishvili. In fact, many of them, if not, I think the majority of them only have one career line in their CVs, and it is linked with one or the other companies of Mr. Ivanishvili. So when we hear political statements, even from the top level of the Georgian government, it is very hard to say who is speaking and to what extent that statement corresponds to the political reality or it is just posturing. And herein lies the problem for those Georgians who hit the streets, but especially, I think, to link up with the last point of Regis, to the European Union that has to make a decision very soon. So the question is Georgia's political elite is having simply bad rhetoric because they're afraid of Russia, for example, or are they genuinely turning Georgia towards the Russian orbit? From what I hear, for example, from statements of the German foreign minister who was recently visiting, or from the statements of the British foreign minister who was recently visiting Tbilisi, most of their criticism is related to rhetoric. And of course, we don't know what is happening behind the closed door. So what is Russia's role? Russia plays role in Georgia simply by existing, and it is simply very, very close, and it already occupies 20% of its territory. So when the Georgian government is pushing the button of, if we do not speak like this, if we do not refrain from criticizing Russia, then we will have war in Georgia, that rhetoric resonates with Georgians, whether or not they support the government. I will reference here one of the very early policy briefs of ECFR, which was done by Mark Galeotti, who was trying to assess the level of vulnerability to the Russian threat. And he used two axes, the level of affinity and the institutional strength, and basically argued that if the institutional strength is low and the level of affinity is high, then the country is essentially exposed to state capture. And I think that's where we are right now. And simply the fact that this state capture is mediated by a single oligarch does not subtract from the essence of the problem. Russia is there, its horns and tail are showing in every action of the Georgian government. The political technology that is deployed widely to demonize non-governmental organizations, LGBT community, independent media, every single person who speaks against the government is somehow part of a global conspiracy. And I'm not exaggerating here. Literally, the ruling party chairman has been talking about Satanists, and one of the pundits affiliated with the state media yesterday was talking about NGOs being the masons of the devil's foundations or Antichrist foundations in Georgia. So it's reaching that level of shrill propaganda that we are used to hear from Moscow. And I think this is something that the European Union officials should understand, that we have rhetoric that is not only it is detached from reality, but it's creating an alternative reality. And that alternative reality is extremely compatible with Russia. So whether or not we can prove 100%ly that Mr. Ivanishvili or the Georgian government is in cahoots with Russia by trying to circumvent sanctions, etc. This is, of course, very hard to prove. But whether or not we can prove it, we can see that in this alternative reality that the government is creating, Georgia is becoming part of the Russian orbit once again. And I will end this by a little phrase just to convey to you the type of dilemma that now Georgia's civil society actors are in. And of course they did protest against this law, they protest against various actions of the government, but at the stage where we are, there is a dilemma. Do we speak against Georgia's candidacy to the European Union, and therefore also in our minds undermine Georgia's chances, which might never appear again in 10 or 20 years to come? Or do we speak for Georgia's candidacy to the European Union and essentially grant the opportunity for the Georgian dream to sell it as its success and win the elections in 2024, and maybe to complete that U-turn, which they are now implementing in a more shy way? So this is a very serious question to which, at this stage, I feel, while conversing to Georgian civil society leaders, they do not have an answer. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Java. And before we come to Katarina, I still remind you that you can ask your questions. We already have one question in our chat box that I will read it. But before we come with my questions to Katarina, and with this difficult background that really poses challenges for the CFR policies towards Georgia, so Katarina, the Georgia's government rhetoric has recently become very hostile to the EU and other Western partners. How does it seem from Brussels? Do you think the EU needs to already develop a new approach towards Georgia, or a bit later, when and if the EU candidacy status conditions, those 12 points, won't be addressed by Tbilisi? How can the EU improve the situation? And if it can, and how to efficiently sharpen our policies to distinct Georgian people, Georgian society, which is mostly pro-Western and wants to keep this pro-European, pro-Western course, with the government that blocks it with its own actions. I know this is not easy, but still, I would be happy, as many of us would be happy to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be part of this briefing or seminar that we have. Always enjoy my ECFR engagements. I was in Tbilisi, in fact, 10 days ago. This was shortly after the Rustaveli demonstrations. We were, in fact, there on the day when the European Union flag was burnt. And we were there for our consultations with the heads of delegations from the whole region and also from Central Asia. But obviously, my EAS colleagues and I took the time and had consultations with the Georgian government, with all the political parties in one room in our hotel. And also I hosted a fairly extensive meeting over lunch with the broad spectrum of the civil society. And very quick comment on the last point that you just made is, in terms of the dilemma. Do we argue for a candidate status of Georgia now? Is it not going to then be used by the ruling party? Will it be seen as reflective of the very strong, over 80% EU ambitions of the population? Very clearly, the civil society, media, NGO representatives, and all the political parties in the parliament are very much taking one side. There was not a single person that we have met in our extensive 3 days visit that would not have argued for Georgia needing the candidate status now. So that was quite remarkable and not fully expected. We actually went there expecting a little bit of the dilemma that Jabba just described, to feel it, to see it happening, and we didn't. It was unequivocal, and I put this on the table. I said, but this is what you guys are arguing. Everybody said, doesn't matter who's in the government, this is what we need to help us and not discourage us on the European path. So that's the first point I want to make. The second is that, and I've been, first time I was in Georgia was in 1986. Many of you probably have not been born at that time or were in grammar school. And I started working with Georgia or on affairs of Georgia when our first meeting, when I was at the World Bank, and our first meeting was still with Mr. Shevardnadze. So I'm an old hat on Georgia, and have great affection for the country and the culture and the nature and the people and the food and the wine and everything. I found this time Georgia full of real contradictions. On the one hand, the divergence of the population ambitions and the path that, as Regis mentioned, the commentators are commenting on. But the second contradiction is between the pronouncements, including in bilateral meetings, bigger meetings, smaller meetings of the Georgian government vis-a-vis EU representatives, and some of the steps. That's another contradiction. And the third one is not so much a contradiction, but there is this, Georgians are very proud people, and I would even say with a sense of entitlement, which for somebody from a country like mine, where we have a chip on our shoulder, is almost surprising. We deserve this, we deserve that. Now, the word deserved was very much used in a lot of the interactions, and the almost sort of incomprehension that compared to Ukraine and Moldova not getting the candidate status was really the first time the EU signaled displeasure. Georgia has been used to positive reinforcement, encouragement, being showered with attention and resources, etc. And suddenly, and I must say that this reaction was very similar whether you talk to the government or to the opposition or to the civil society. And so this was very interesting, and I was actually commenting to our interlocutors that the framing of "oh, we deserve" perhaps is not the most helpful in this situation, because I look at Georgia from the perspective of the EU. I understand the dilemmas and the trade-offs and the non-linear developments in the new democracies. I come from one. We were going through the enlargement process, but one needs to also understand the dynamics inside the EU and the trade-offs and the difficulties the EU has, especially some member states, with the notion of enlargement. And is this going to paralyze the decision-making in Brussels or not? So the notion, "oh, we deserve it," is not helpful, whether it comes from a government representative or from an NGO or a civil society. So that's my second point. I have two more points to make. One is that, look, Russia is a very active player in Georgia. It's not even 20%. It's actually almost a full quarter. It's 24% of the territory has been occupied. And since the occupation of 2008, there has been a very, very strong hybrid warfare in Georgia, whether it's involvement with political parties, whether it's political corruption, whether it's disinformation, whether it's using the church, etc. I was very much taken, and this is not how I have seen or how we have seen the 5th of July. Regis, you mentioned that that was the beginning of the decoupling of the Georgian government from the EU path. I would not have, and perhaps I wasn't there and it was COVID and I didn't travel. I was there now first time since before COVID. Maybe that's something that we could have taken more seriously, but really the LGBTI context in an Orthodox country perhaps is not the most signaling event that one takes the most seriously. So I think that that's where the analysis perhaps is a little bit lagging in time or differing, but there is no question that the divergence in the official pronouncements and statement of ambitions and the steps is real. I mean, there is no question about that. Now, as to, and that's my last area I want to comment in the, what to do now, where we are, and what to expect from the EU. First point, when we say what to expect from the EU, it's not the institutions in Brussels, it's the member states. That's the first point that one needs to be very, very cognizant of. We can make, and we will draft the best of recommendations and analyses and prepare the ground, etc. Any step on the path to EU enlargement is subject, every step, not any step, every step, and there are about 100 of them between sending an application and actually becoming a member state. Every single one is subject to unanimity among member states. And we can just take the example of North Macedonia and Albania to remind ourselves that these are steps that sometimes are taken over long periods of time, spanning years. Although now there is clearly new momentum in enlargement, but nevertheless, it's complicated. What could make it easier is to realize that the delta between not having, and this is what I tell my Georgian friends, look, you have a European perspective. You are in the anteroom of enlargement. And the delta between not having European perspective and having European perspective is much bigger than having European perspective and candidate status. The candidate status has symbolic value, and I understand the importance of symbols in politics. But in terms of practical steps or practical impact is not as big. Georgia will be part of the enlargement assessment in the fall, whether it's a candidate or whether it's not a candidate, right? And this assessment will come with yearly regularity. You are already in the snares of our machine, of our enlargement machine. So you're not leaving that space, but I do understand that the symbolic nature of the candidate status, and I also understand the symbolism of not being judged at the same level as Ukraine and Moldova. I mean, those are important steps. Now, the way to get to candidate status is to carry out the 12 steps, and this is the other sort of contradiction. And going back to Regis's fairly unequivocal assessment, a number of the steps have been carried out. There is this, we cannot say that there is zero movement, not at all. There is actually very good progress on 4 or 5. There is some progress on others, less progress on or little progress on yet others. So the picture is really mixed. And is this because the population is so pro-European and one doesn't want to go further in the steps? Because again, I mean, the communication and relations with the key ministries and is very good. There is give and take. There are consultations on a regular basis. So the sense of contradictions and questions that appear there is still with me, and I think will be with me even after this very good discussion.
Thank you, Katarina. And we already have 3 questions for you personally. I will try to combine them in, I don't know, shortly in one. The first question was on about the other law, a controversial law about de-oligarchization, which Georgian Dream is about to adopt, maybe in the next few weeks, despite the critical opinion of the Venice Commission. And according to the author of the question, that this law will damage the media and opposition, possibly NGOs, more than the law on foreign agents would have done. And the law would be used against wealthy individuals supporting the media and opposition and will not touch Ivanishvili. So the question is, will the EU make it clear that the law should not be passed? Without the clear position on this, it will be impossible to stop this very damaging legislation. The second question was about the role and the position of the civil society of Georgia in the Eastern Partnership Forum. Does it work there? Does the civil society is active there? If I understood the question by Iris correctly. And there was, I don't know if this was more a question or a comment, but still this is about the dilemma that we have been discussing for a pretty long time already. Jabba in his intervention, he said that if the government does nothing to fulfill the 12 points, should they still be awarded or gifted the candidate status? So according to the author of the question, unfortunately it's shown as anonymous. In the case there is no clear or unequivocal position, everyone would realize that if Georgian Dream is gifted the status without the progress, they would do worse things. Even so, the situation would even deteriorate. So let's start with those 3, and then the next question would be, I think, to all of you, but I will read it a bit later.
Okay, quick reaction, not to monopolize the time. Progress of the 12 steps. Well, as I mentioned already, the not doing anything on the 12 steps is not already a reality. There has been movement on, and there has been very good progress on about a third, and good progress on about another third, and then there is still others to there were more movement, where more is very much needed, which of course go to the core of the issue. One is on the polarization in the society. One is indeed on the media, so and the judiciary. So no progress is definitely not in the cards, because that ship has sailed. When there is actually very solid progress on some of them. So then it becomes qualitative appreciation. and where the issue that I mentioned of the delta between what Georgia has now and where it wants to get, right? This is not, we are not talking about opening negotiations for entry. That would be yet another step where there would be another set of recommendations, right? So it's not something that we are not discussing here, granting EU membership or even opening negotiations. So that is going to be way beyond my pay grade to make that appreciation and judge whether the geopolitical context plays a role or doesn't. And it's not going to be an easy one, but I would. I think that the next few weeks and months will show us whether the Georgian government is serious about fulfilling more of the steps than so far. I think I would leave it at that. Now, on the Eastern Partnership Forum, I think the Georgian Georgian NGOs and civil society is very active. This morning, I was opening together with colleagues. High-level conference of the think tanks on the future of Eastern Partnership, and there were a number of representatives of the civil society. There was the representative of the government, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs as well. So I think that Georgia is very much part of the discourse in the Eastern Neighborhood, Eastern Partnership context, if I understood the question correctly. Now, on the de-oligarchization law, look, there are two approaches, and I think the Venice Commission was very clear on having a preference for one while not ruling the other approach. Either it's much more in favor of a comprehensive approach, depersonalized approach to dealing with the oligarchization. Now, in environments which are institutionally not as strong, it's easier to do one than the other, than hope for a comprehensive approach. I think we will be very clear, just like we were very clear about the law on foreign agents. I think we will be very clear on what works and what doesn't work. When we had the foreign minister here last week, he mentioned that there are going to be amendments to the current law in the parliament, and they will be sent to us for review. So it's a little bit premature for me to rule out what's going to happen or rule on what's going to happen with the law before we see these new amendments. But I think that this is one area where the Venice Commission opinion was fairly detailed, and I hope that the recommendations will be taken on board and followed.
Thank you, Katarina. And again, we have a very similar question to what we have already discussed, but still thought-provoking. So the question by Mariami Ziziguri: what is the path for a bright future in Georgia if the government if the government stands behind Russian shadow and the Georgian people want to be part of the EU? What is the solution here? How far can the EU involve itself in the politics of Georgia, and how long should the Georgian society stand behind the European perspective without Europe? We have other question now, to Regis and Jaba. What is the role of the president, a former citizen of the EU, of course? Can she be a counterweight to Ivanishvili? And the question to Katarina, again, if there are conditions to become a candidate and conditions beyond to open accession negotiations, if that's so far off the Georgian dream, think there is no real prospect of getting under the EU umbrella. So it's better to make your peace with Russia where the benefits come quickly. So I think that we should start with Regis. Jaba, who want to go first?
I will go. Just one word about what I say about LGBT. The 5th of July 2021 events. Indeed, I didn't elaborate enough. I think it was really important, and I think since 2012, when Mr. Putin came back to the Kremlin, let's say, the LGBT question became a geopolitical tool. And we observed this in all the region. And immediately we saw everywhere in the region how it was used by the Russians and by their proxies, let's say, in the region. And it is also coming back for Georgia. And immediately after that in Georgia, I think the question started to be much more important than it was before. The various groups started to really talk about it, to use it, to demonstrate more. And it is, I think, important again, because Russia can't do positive soft power, can't exert a positive soft power in Georgia. It's not attractive. There is almost no pro-Russian people in Georgia, even though we should now, I would love to see some more precise surveys on Georgia, what means being pro-European, because there is a big variety under that, and it explains also a lot of what we can't understand. Being pro-European for some would mean to be rich as Europe can be rich. It would mean for others freedom, human rights, and so on. For others, it would mean being part of a Christian family. So it is really different. And the Ivanishvili's government is using this a lot also, because some could be pro-European, but also they are right to do so. It's really respectful. They would say we have to be cautious with Russia. So maybe Europe, but not NATO, or maybe not Europe, or being just out of Europe as a neighbor country, but not member of it, because it would anger Russia and it would be dangerous. And this is finally the core of Georgian Dream's electorate. And one word about the 12 points. Of course, there are some of them are progressing, but what could be the expectation for Georgia to become a candidate status, if you don't feel the points on the media freedom, on the civil society, on the Bureau of Anti-Corruption, which was settled, but with no tools, because it doesn't have any investigation power, for example, and so on. And it corresponds very much with how this government is working. Again, because 80% of the population is pro-European, so you always have to show that on some of your moves, some of your decisions, of your deeds, you are pro-European. But in the same times, on the core issues, the Georgian government is obviously, since 2 years at least, going away from this path. So I think this is really important to understand what they have in mind, because all the leaders in the region remembers what happened to Yanukovych, the Maidan moment. So it is really important. On the bright future question, I don't know how to answer, because first comes the question of security. These last days, and I could see in the crowd, in the rallies, how people were quite aware about that, despite most of them were really young. But some say, we are in the street, we don't want this law, we want the government to remove this law, to withdraw this law. But in the meantime, we are maybe not ready to overthrow the government. I mean, the question was almost not mentioned, but sometimes we are talking about that. Because, again, they remember the Yanukovych moment. Overthrowing the government, if it would happen, and I don't say that it would happen, I don't say that at the moment we are in this dynamics, not at all, but people were thinking about that, some of them. And of course, behind, we remember what happened when the government was overthrown in Ukraine. So before thinking about the European future, in the immediate moment, what happened now, the question is really the security. What could happen if Ivanishvili would be, and government would be overthrown? On the president, she's not a counterweight. Let's say for two reasons. One is on the institution. The president has a very, very little power. It's mostly honorific powers or ceremonial ones. So she can't do a lot. And also because of her personality. Till a year ago, till the beginning of the year of the war, let's say in Ukraine, or the wide-scale invasion of Ukraine, she was speaking very differently. And she was still, okay, she changed a little bit before, but she was still blaming the former President Saakashvili for having provoked Russia and provoked the war back in 2008. She was more blaming Saakashvili than she was blaming Russia, let's say. And even it caused some controversy in the country, even with the church, when she was candidate for the presidency. Then she was really badly elected. And she was supported by Ivanishvili, that everybody understood who he was and how he was tied probably by Russia. So at the time, so she lost a lot of credibility because of that. And now she's regaining, because since 1 year she is more, let's say, blaming Russia. She's now criticizing the government and so on. So she's more listened in the country probably, but still she needs to do a lot yet to recover her, let's say, support within the society and within the segment of the society which are politically active. I'm stopping here.
Java, would you jump in?
Yeah. Yes, I think I would like to comment about this issue of the law on the oligarchization. I think this is a good example of the way it links to this 12 requirements for Georgia's candidacy. Talking about these 12 commandments, first of all, we have to understand that even though there are 12, substantively they are very different. Some of them are quite technical, some of them go to the fundamentals of how the country functions. As Rashis was rightly saying, if we do not have a significant progress on de-oligarchization, we have a regress on the freedom of the media and freedom of association. If we importantly don't solve the issue of courts, which have been captured by the ruling party, then whether or not we'll fulfill other more technical recommendations, in essence, the implementation context for the European Union does not change. They will have some more better laws, but the context will remain the same. And this is where we come to the way in which the laws are understood. I think almost everywhere that I went and worked in the post-socialist space, the laws, in difference to the Western Europe, are there to punish you, not to facilitate your life. And this government has shown very well how everything that it passes, even if it fulfills the requirements of the Western parties, these laws will primarily be used for punishing the people they don't like, simply because there are no institutional checks and balances left, and there is no political check in the parliament on the power of the ruling party and the government. So the moment that the law of the oligarchization was proposed, it was said very clearly by the party leadership that it will be used against one person, so-called oligarch, who they think is financing the opposition television. Hence the question from Sergei Kapanets that came in. And that position has not changed. It is very similar to the law on foreign agents. The government was forced to step back from its adoption, but let's pay attention, how did it step back? Actually, none of the Georgian deputies who voted for that law in the first reading have voted against it in the second reading. It was by the opposition's votes that it was defeated. And the ruling party said afterwards, through its spokesperson, the prime minister, and the head of the ruling party, that even though the law was not passed, it has served its purpose to discover who the agents of the foreign powers were. And they are pursuing that logic in going after several prominent leaders of civil society and going after the free media after this law was defeated. But to them, it was passed. Yeah, it was defeated accidentally by the foreign agents. So this mentality of playing with the laws, playing with the official position, and saying yes, there will be some amendments made, so that there is this delaying tactic, and then the European Union should remember well how Charles Michel's agreement was thrown out of the window, how many other agreements on the courts were thrown out of the window, and there was a very strong reaction to it. But once the deed is done, the deed is done. This is still the sitting government of the country, and the laws are laws. So actually, about the bright future, I'm not very optimistic. Currently, Georgian Dream has Georgian political system locked up. It is very similar that has been as something that has been happening within the European Union with Hungary and partially with Poland. The government that controls the parliament fully controls the most influential media, controls the courts, and controls most of the economy, has really little to fear but the very widespread public protest. So I see with difficulty what the counterbalance to this government positions could be, apart from a similar development that we've seen with the foreign agent law, essentially kind of a direct democracy working. Otherwise, the representative democracy right now is broken, I think, beyond repair.
Thank you, Java. And would you, Katerina, want to comment on this issue, on this question about incentives for the Georgian government? Again, I will read it again by Ian Bond. He's asking that if there are conditions to become a candidate and there are conditions beyond to open accession negotiations, then obviously the Georgian dream would think of if they are not able to get under the EU umbrella, so it's better to make a deal with Russia where benefits come quickly.
Well, on this one, obviously, that's a sovereign choice of Georgia, but the fact that every step of the way has conditions, and pretty onerous one, is a well-known fact of anybody who reads, you know, a simple paper on EU accession process. It is. Even if the negotiations were open tomorrow, it still will be a long process. We all had to go through it, and ultimately being in the EU was worth it. Now I would very much hope that the Georgian government plays a longer game, right, than the next set of conditions. I mean, even if they're fulfilled, there will be more, because that's the nature of the beast. That's the nature of the process. So, if at this stage the calculation would be in favor of Russia, then it's very hard to sway that. I don't know whether I understood the question correctly, but that would be my quick reaction. But if I may quickly comment on what Jabba was saying about the political system being broken, I mean, for those of you who know or follow Georgia more closely these days than I have done in the last 2-3 years, I mean, it would be very useful to also understand what role does the participation or non-participation in the parliament of the opposition parties play a role in the impasse, right? It's because there are. We had a meeting with 9 different people, and all very dynamic and very outspoken and eloquent. One of them was Georgian Dream, but then there were all the different other parties, and Georgia is famous for having, or infamous rather, in the last few years for different parts of the political spectrum playing different games. So I just wonder whether that has something to do with the nature of the system now.
And we have more questions, and I think the one is a very important one, because we have been talking about incentives for the government, obviously for Ivanishvili, for the foreign policy course, but we have, Georgia is still a democratic country with those problems, but still with the opportunity for people to vote and choose their government. And here is the question about future elections, and Jakob Renier is expecting you to get a prediction about the upcoming elections. Do you think it will be a showdown between the pro-Russian camp and the united pro-Western camp? The other question comes from Ugne Matulevicenia. The French Foreign Minister Katerina Corona mentioned the possibility to sanction Georgian oligarchs as well as the Moldovan ones for the destabilization attempts. How realistic is that avenue, and what would be the impact for Georgia's internal politics and the EU integration? And the third question would be about the player that was forgotten during our discussion or not mentioned, about the United States, and what is the US role right now and maybe probable role in this problematic situation. And yeah, so please, Regis, go ahead.
I wanted Jabba to start. Thank you very much. On the upcoming elections, I think it will be pretty the same. One of the reasons, we saw this last year's election after election, the election climate being in a kind of degradation and more, less democratic, certainly more tricks to win the elections from the ruling party and so on. And on the other side, the opposition is in a big disarray. It's extremely divided, mostly because of its internal divisions, partly also because of the game of the oligarch, as we can see. It's difficult to prove, of course, but I think it's quite clear. So it creates a real problem, because we don't feel that the opposition is ready at the moment to really challenge the government. And we see also what is the mood since the beginning of the month. It changed a lot, and I'm afraid that it will continue this way till the election. So I'm afraid, but I'm often mistaken. So let's be optimistic. But I'm afraid that the climate will be quite bad. That the government won't be challenged. I'm not here to say that the government has to lose or not. That's not the point. But I mean, on the principle, democratic principle, we should see that, and we see the mood in the society sometimes to send the message during the election, as it was, for example, during the presidential election, that they disagree or they are not happy with the government. Not totally, but at least they express it. So quite pessimist about the climate that will prevail during this election. It won't be exactly pro-Russian camps versus pro-Western camps, because never the government will show directly that it is pro-Russian. So it will try to portray itself as a pro-European, but which has to be cautious with Russia, and they will try really to blame the opposition for example, triggering a kind of second front in the war in Ukraine, which is totally invented, obviously, but it is a way to really disqualify, let's say, the opposition. As we saw also these days, for example, despite the government withdraw the law, for example, then they blame the people in the street, not the opposition, because basically the political opposition was not the demonstration. No one talked on the stage and so on. It was really coming from the civil society. But these young people were demonized. They were called even Satanists, which is a vocabulary which is usually in the mouth of Mr. Medvedev or Mr. Putin, for example. And it's quite interesting to see also the way the new kind of tools of propaganda which are used, which is really new in the Georgian politics. On the question on the sanctions, I think, as I know, according to my sources, that indeed this is something that worries the ruler, let's say, of the country, Mr. Ivanishvili. Is really sensible to this question, and it leads me, by the way, to the third question to speak about the USA, because, for example, there was this discussion or this trial, let's say, about the Credit Suisse, in which Mr. Ivanishvili is involved, and I think he won finally, but in front of the court. But for example, he thought, and I've got it from several different sources, that is convinced that finally this Credit Suisse story, which should never happen, was somehow masterminded by the US, and he's really afraid on the sanction that the US could decide on him, and as I know, he's trying to even to talk with the US at the moment because of that. So that's probably something which is quite powerful, in fact. Jabba?
Yes, I agree with you, Regis. I will add one point here, I think, which is very, for me, it helps the analysis sometimes when I'm confused about very controversial and contradictory messages that I hear from Georgia. Essentially, for me, to think how the oligarchs think, and Regis, you've done research in that, it means to think about money. It means to think about resources. As my old political science professor used to say, politics is about who gets what, when, and how. And I think looking at the 2024 elections, Mr. Ivanishvili is thinking precisely in these terms, because what he would like to have is that the Georgian dream is the only game in town. We see already, and there has been tendency towards that in Georgian politics before, that the party that has all the levers is trying to have certain factions or the fake political parties that garner to the different kind of electorates. We had the emergence of so-called people's power faction that is clearly going into the hard pro-Putinist or nativist direction, kind of Donald Trump mixed with Vladimir Putin. And there were rumors, although they have never materialized, that there will be something more pro-European emerging from the Georgian dream. So the ideal situation, of course, for the ruling party of the day is to have 2024 elections being competed between its various factions. So one way or another, they win. To achieve that situation, you need to silence the media and silence the civil society. And the easiest way to silence them is by closing the tap on money. That is what the attack on Mr. Kezerashvili is based on, this other oligarch that the government wants to go after with the oligarchization law, and partially this attack on civil society, the foreign agents law. What it was doing is essentially it was creating the conditions in which the only voice in the Georgian society that is heard through media and various other sources, that is not funded directly by the government or by the ruling party, or in the shadows by Bidzina Ivanishvili, will be cut off by reduction of the foreign funding and by appropriation of this foreign funding through gongos, the government organized, non-governmental organizations, of which there are many already established. If you've noticed, Mr. Dinaradze, the spokesperson and faction head for the ruling party, as well as Mr. Kobakhidze, they've said, well, not all non-governmental organizations are bad, right? These are just bigger non-governmental organizations that have become too influential, and we will make sure that the money we receive from the foreign donors is going to the right ones. So that was the kind of a plan to appropriate and channel the financial resources that are now provided through the international agencies and donors like the United States or the European Union. So I think a lot in 2024 will depend on whether or not there are uncontrolled financial flows from Mr. Ivanishvili going to the actors that can contest the reality that the ruling party wants to create, so the free media, non-governmental organizations, fact checkers, and to contest politically, because one of the most important thrusts of this foreign agent law was against those organizations which the ruling party claims are political, like Movement Khmara or Sinchrilia and Droa, that they say receive funding from the European Union, and they shouldn't because they are political actors. So political actors and independent actors, whether or not they will have funding, that will decide a lot in 2024 elections.
Thank you, Java. Katerina, would you like to add something and answer one of the questions, or should we switch to other ones?
Nothing at this point.
So let me then ask some of my questions, because I think that we have more or less answered the main questions from the chat box. And we have 15 minutes left, so just keep this in mind. My first question would be about the current government's position on Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It seems to me that it has changed a bit under the Georgian Dream rule. The previous governments were way tougher on those territories, while the current government seems to be rather or passive or even ignorant to the issue at some points. The second question would be about Georgia-Ukraine relations and Georgia's ambiguous position on Ukraine. Tbilisi refrains from criticizing Russia, but it's very generous on accusing Kyiv of alleged desire to drag Georgia to the war with Russia. So what reason do you see for such a position, and why they are so hostile to Ukraine? And Ukraine obviously has to respond. And the third question would be about Saakashvili's house, another human rights issue, but a very important one in terms of geopolitical issues or foreign policy issues. What is going on with him? How bad is the situation? And is there any diplomatic activity from the West to achieve his release? Anyone eager to start, or should I?
I start again?
Okay.
I will start with your last question. And it would be a way for me to also address the question of someone who was asking about what should be the EU policy in this situation. Saakashvili is really, I mean, it's important, less for Saakashvili as such, but for what it means for the country and why this happens. He lost more than 50 kilograms in jail, that's for sure, and within 1 year, 1 year and a half. So, I mean, it starts to be, of course, dangerous for his health. But I want to stress on something, someone's case, which for me is maybe even more important for the sake of the country, is the one of Guaramia. And this is my way to answer to one of the questions we didn't have time to answer, but what should Europe do? I think we should fight a lot for Guaramia. Again, not because of him personally, that I almost don't know, or not much, but because of what it means. Because he is the head of the most important television in the country. And I could criticize, and I did a lot in the past, this television, which is really politically active and so on, but still it plays a crucial role in the democracy in Georgia, and the dynamic, the democratic dynamics is in the country, as we saw it in the streets 3 weeks ago. So Guaramia is really important. He should be free, because with him in jail, probably within few months, the most important opposition TV will disappear. The salaries were not given to the employees. They have like twice less or 3 times less cameramen that they had a year ago. So this is really important. And if I look personally at my understanding of the country, how I built my understanding on who is Bidzina and so on, I got a lot of information through this television. For example, how this so-called opposition party, Alliance of Patriots, was financed both, while we knew, and I knew, that he was pro-Russian party, both financed by Mr. Ivanishvili himself, or he organized the finance of that party, and in the meantime financed directly by the administration of the Russian president. So it helped me to understand how it works, and how the pro-Russian forces also are supported within the country. And I got it through, at the time it was Rustavi 2, but let's say through this opposition television. On the Georgian-Ukraine relations, I think again it's for Mr. Ivanishvili a way to show to Russia on which side the government stands. Again, and playing with this idea that finally Georgia has to be cautious with Russia, and this is true and this is respectable, but this is not about what it is about in reality. And this is why every opportunity was seized this last year to always create some controversy with Ukraine. And it started when Ukraine sent to Georgia a plane to take some volunteers who wanted to fight there and prevented to land and so on. So I think it explains a lot about how I mean the Ukrainian Georgian-Ukrainian relations, where stands this government. On Abkhazia and Ossetia, there is not much policy. Finally, they don't really touch. This government doesn't really work on this on this question. Finally, I just see this recently, this last month. Some worrying information coming from Abkhazia, Ossetia, but not from the Georgian government. But sometimes it looks like to respond to the policy of the Georgian government. For example, the Abkhazian authorities were saying that Georgia tries, the West wants to open a second front in Georgia, which is exactly what says the government here in Tbilisi, for example. But in terms of policy, I don't see any policy at the moment. What we hear from Russia, and this is interesting, but it doesn't come directly from the core of the power. It comes from ideologies. People who would say, for example, look, Georgia, if you would just forget your Georgian dreams, your European dreams, sorry, your Western dreams, then maybe you could recover Abkhazia and Ossetia within some other political entity as the Eurasian Union or something like this. This is something we hear from time to time. Not from the Georgian government, but for some players within Georgia, like pro-Russian players.
Who wants to come next? Katerina, would you?
Yeah, just on the Abkhazia, I agree with Regis that that in the last time there hasn't been a lot of attention turned our direction by the Georgian authorities. And I also want to comment. I mean, with the premise of playing into the Russian narrative, if that's the premise of the argument, then the position on Ukraine is clear. And this would be again one of the contradictions I would point out to. I was actually pleasantly surprised by the omnipresent Ukrainian flags painted on buildings and fences and houses and restaurants and waving on every corner in Tbilisi. I haven't been to other parts of Georgia on this recent visit. So I don't know whether it's just a Tbilisi phenomenon or whether it's outside, elsewhere as well. But there is very clearly a correlation between the pro-European leaning of the population and a positive disposition towards Ukraine. And from the Ukrainian perspective, I can tell that the initial position of Georgia was not taken lightly in Kiev. But I'll stop here.
Jaban?
Well, on Ukraine, obviously, there is a very personal animus as well, and that cannot be underestimated, because the personal likes and dislikes play a very important role in this government. Personally, Mr. Prime Minister is known to hold a grudge very long time, and possibly also with Mr. Ivanishvili, who is much less publicly outspoken. But it was widely perceived that the current Ukrainian government is supportive of Saakashvili, who was considered the archenemy of the Georgian dream. So by the sole that fact, the Zelensky government has no sympathy from the Georgian dream government, especially as they, I don't know, officially, but probably also to a certain extent personally, have linked the arrival of Saakashvili to Georgia with the Ukrainian government. They said it was facilitated one way or another by the Ukrainian authorities. So that created a lot of ill will, which then has expressed itself in very unequivocal statements and general stance once the war was renewed at this full scale. So I think there are two elements playing. There is also a very personal political animosity to what Zelensky's government is and what it represents, also by how it governs, which is also in a dramatic contrast. And on the other hand, there is, of course, a very demonstrative signal towards Russia that Georgia is not going to have a clear position on Ukraine, which is also, it is a very subtle game, because on the one hand, the Georgian government points out in every meeting with its international interlocutors that on the international arena, Georgia has voted the way the West voted. Yeah, even though it has not adhered to some of the sanctions, but it passed accepted the economic, the financial ones, over which it has highest degree of control. It has asked supported the ICC resolution at the UN. Everywhere, Georgia on the international diplomatic forums voted the way it should have. On the other hand, the domestic political rhetoric has been quite the opposite. But what is important to note here is that this is exactly the domestic political rhetoric that is heard and understood in the Kremlin, because there was a very positive feedback coming from various levels of the Russian government, saying that they appreciate what they call Georgia keeping the independent position against the backdrop of the pressure from the United States. So Russia accepts that under pressure from the United States, Georgia may vote certain way at the UN General Assembly, but it having an official position pronounced in Tbilisi, which is not in support of Russia, but at least not in support of Ukraine, is acceptable for them. So I think in terms of keeping the balance there with Moscow, Georgian government has been doing quite a good job. I want to agree emphatically with Regis when it comes to the importance of keeping the free media alive. I mean, today I'm here also representing one of the semi-media, semi-NGO outlets, and I want to stress that the smaller media outlets, especially the online media outlets, are often the outlets that those young people that are in the streets read and watch. And there are several, Regis has mentioned one, OC Media, there is Publica, there is NetGazeti, there are others, there is Tabula, that are very widely read disproportionately more than the TVs by the young people, and they shape their opinion and thought. So I think they're mostly supported by international organizations. That's why they were also one of the primary targets of the foreign agent law. And should this international support disappear, this outlet will disappear as well. So I think we have to really pay attention to what happens with Tavari TV, because it has such a wide national coverage, but also to the more niche media that have the ear of the young people who are very pro-European.
Thank you so much. And the 1 hour and 30 minutes have passed already, and they passed very quickly. I thank you so much, Katarina, Jaba, and Regis, for your brilliant analysis, for your thoughts. And I think that we even now have not only better understanding of what is happening in Georgia, but even more questions for the other seminar. And I really hope that we'll be having another one on Georgia, because I feel personally that Georgia lacks a bit of attention just because of the crises that are happening in Eastern Europe. So thank you so much. I wish you a pleasant evening to all of you, to the speakers, to the participants, and hope to see you pretty soon again. Thank you and bye.
Thanks a lot of you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.